Chapter 1. The Slaughterer's Wake. The battlefield was silent. Not the silence of peace, nor the hushed reverence of the dead, but the absence of anything left to kill. The still air reeked of blood, thick and cloying, mixed with the acrid stench of burnt flesh. Flies gathered in black, writhing clouds, feasting on the corpses strewn across the torn earth. Vorthar stood in the center of the carnage, his breath ragged, his muscles still twitching from the thrill of combat. His crimson-stained axe, an ancient weapon known as Gore fury, hung limply in his grip, its rune-etched blade still drinking in the lifeblood of his fallen foes. But there were no foes here. Only his own. The Gorefang Reavers, his warband, his brothers, the sworn warriors who had once followed him into battle with devotion, now lay scattered in pieces around him. Some had been cleaved from shoulder to hip, others had been crushed into the dirt, their armor torn apart like parchment. Faces he had known for years, men who had bled and burned for Khorne alongside him, stared sightlessly at the blood-darkened sky. Vorthar could remember none of it. Not truly. Only fragments, disjointed and feverish. Flashes of crimson, the roar of battle in his ears, the exhilarating, unbearable hunger for slaughter. He had felt the presence of the blood god, the fire of Khorne's gaze upon him. Had it been a blessing or a curse? The rage had consumed him, again. He staggered, a low snarl escaping his lips, his breath fogged in the frigid air of the chaos wastes, his bare chest heaving beneath the jagged iron plates of his armor. His body was a canvas of old wounds, but none of them hurt anymore. Pain had become as meaningless as mercy. Khorne had given him power, more than any mortal deserved. He had granted Vorthar the strength to carve his name into the annals of slaughter, to become a living weapon of destruction. But there had been a price. There was always a price. The others had tried to restrain him. He could remember that much. He saw glimpses of their faces contorted with fear, not of the enemy, but of him. They had shouted his name, tried to hold him back, to pull him from the blood haze that consumed his mind. But he was no longer a man in those moments. He was a force of nature, a storm of steel and bone and fury. And now he was alone. The wind howled across the broken land, kicking up dust tinged red with the lifeblood of the fallen. The chaos wastes stretched endlessly in every direction, barren, merciless, a land where only the strongest survived. Vorthar turned his gaze skyward, toward the dark, shifting clouds above. He could feel something watching him. Khorne. The blood god did not whisper like Tzeentch sorcerers, nor tempt like Slaanesh perfume degenerates. Khorne did not promise. He only demanded. Blood. Death. War everlasting. Vorthar's lip curled in a grimace. He did not need whispers to understand the will of his god. He had failed. A warband was a warrior's pride, strength in numbers a testament to one's worth, and yet here he stood, unworthy, an executioner with no army left to march behind him. The blood god cares not from whence the blood flows, the saying went, but what happened to those whose bloodlust made them unfit even for the butcher's work? His fingers tightened around the haft of his axe. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the next battle awaited. Somewhere more skulls waited to be taken. He had no warband, no banners to fly, no brothers to fight beside him, but the slaughter would never end. Not for him. And if it could not end, then he would drown the world in it. Vorthar turned from the dead, leaving their bodies to the scavengers. The wind screamed as he strode forward, his footsteps heavy against the blood-soaked ground. His path led nowhere. But it also led everywhere. The war was eternal, and he would fight until the last drop of blood had been spilled, even if that last drop was his own. Chapter 2. The Mark of Khorne. The wind screamed across the chaos wastes. A shrieking chorus of tortured souls swept away in the endless storms. Vorthar marched through the desolation, his heavy boots crushing bones and brittle rock alike. His breath came in slow, measured huffs, the only sound beyond the howling gale. The sky above was the color of old blood, shifting and swirling like a living wound, and in the distance, jagged peaks rose like the broken teeth of a slain god. He did not know where he was going. It did not matter. The curse was always with him. For the first time since the slaughter of the Gorefang Reavers, Vorthar allowed himself to remember. Not the crimson haze of battle, not the intoxicating ecstasy of carnage, but what had come before. Before the bloodlust had consumed him. Before Khorne's gaze had fallen too heavily upon his soul. He had once been a warlord. Not just another nameless brute of the wastes, not a mere raider, but a true warrior of Khorne. His name had been spoken with reverence, his warband a horde of unrelenting fury. They had marched under banners soaked in the lifeblood of 1,000 conquests, their ranks swelled with the strongest and most ruthless. He had earned his place through battle, through sheer might, through the offering of skulls to the skull throne. And Khorne had rewarded him. Vorthar's gauntleted fingers traced the deep scar along his chest, the mark burned into his flesh by divine will. The mark of Khorne, a brand of favor, an eternal seal of the blood god's blessing. The day it had been seared into his skin, he had roared in triumph, feeling his god's power surge through his veins like molten iron. His strength had doubled, his endurance had become inhuman, and his thirst for slaughter had grown insatiable. Too insatiable. At first the warband had welcomed his newfound might. With every battle, he had become more unstoppable, carving through enemy lines like a storm of iron and rage. No warrior could stand before him, no beast could match his fury. The warriors of the Gorefang Reavers had fought beside him, basking in his glory. But then the madness began. It had started as whispers in his mind, a constant gnawing hunger that battle could barely sate. The thrill of the kill became an agony when it ended. The blood on his axe was never enough. He felt the rage burning inside him, clawing at his sanity, urging him to kill. To kill. To kill. And then it had turned on his own. He had not meant to strike them down. He had not wanted to, but in the heat of battle, friend and foe had become one and the same. The bloodlust had consumed reason, leaving only slaughter in its wake. The first time, they had forgiven him. The second time, they had feared him. The third time, they had tried to stop him. They had failed. Now he walked alone. There was no warband left to follow him. No banners left to bear his name. The warriors of Khorne gathered in great hordes, bound by blood and battle, but Vorthar could not join them. He had become a blade without a wielder, a beast that could not be tamed. He had once led armies. Now he left only corpses. And still, the mark of Khorne burned on his skin. Vorthar halted atop a crag of blackened stone, his eyes scanning the vast emptiness before him. In the far distance, the remnants of some long-dead city lay crumbling, its skeletal remains jutting from the earth like broken spears. A battle had taken place there once. Perhaps another would take place there soon. It did not matter who the enemy was. Mortal, daemon, beast, it was all the same in the end. He would fight, he would kill, he would drown the world in blood, because that was all that was left for him. He clenched his fists, feeling the strength of the blood god coursing through him. His curse, his gift. Khorne had granted him power beyond measure, but power without purpose was nothing. With a deep growl, Vorthar turned toward the distant ruins. The mark of Khorne burned hotter, as if urging him forward. Somewhere ahead there would be warriors seeking battle. Perhaps they would fight alongside him, perhaps against him. It made no difference. The slaughter was eternal, and so was he. Chapter 3. The Chaos Wastes Beckon. The wind of the Chaos Wastes did not howl, it screamed. It roared through the shattered landscape like a living thing, carrying with it the echoes of battles long lost, the shrieks of the dying, and the guttural laughter of Daemons feasting on the souls of the fallen. The land itself was twisted, a shifting, writhing expanse of blackened rock, rivers of boiling blood, and spires of bone that jutted from the cracked earth like the ribs of a forgotten god. Vorthar strode through this accursed wasteland with purpose. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, his path had meaning beyond the next kill. The Brazen Chalice of Khorne. It had begun as nothing more than a whisper carried on the wind, a murmur of something ancient, something powerful, something that might finally grant him control over the insatiable hunger that had become his existence. A warlock's dying curse, a demon's mocking laughter, the fevered ramblings of a slaughter priest bleeding out on the battlefield. Each had spoken its name before death took them. A relic forged in the furnaces of Khorne's own realm, a chalice overflowing with the blood of the greatest champions to have ever lived. They said that to drink from it was to master the thirst, to wield bloodlust as a weapon rather than be enslaved by it. Or perhaps it was just another lie, another false promise whispered into the ears of desperate men. Vorthar did not care. If the chalice was real, he would claim it. If it was false, he would slaughter whatever wretched fool had spread its legend. The whispers spoke of the skull cairns, a place of death even by the standards of the wastes. An ancient battlefield where the bones of champions lay in vast mounds, rising from the earth in grotesque mockeries of mountains. It was said that those who sought the cairns found themselves tested, their bodies broken, their minds shattered by visions of the battles that had shaped the realm of Khorne itself. Vorthar relished the challenge. As he pressed deeper into the wastes, the air grew thick with the scent of iron and rot. The ground beneath him shifted, not soil, not stone, but something else. Flesh? Bone? He did not look down. The wastes had their own ways of tormenting those too weak to endure them. He crested a jagged ridge and beheld the path ahead. The skull cairns. Great monoliths of bone and blackened rock, stacked higher than any fortress, stretched across the horizon. Some were crude and jagged, others carved into obscene shapes, grinning faces, leering demonic skulls, towering effigies of battle. Blood dripped from their peaks, though there were no clouds above to rain it down. The earth trembled beneath their weight, as if the very land feared the presence of so much death in one place. Vorthar's grip tightened around the haft of his axe. A presence stirred in the air, ancient, watchful. Not the gaze of Khorne, no. This was something else. Something older. The whispers returned, threading through his mind like tendrils of smoke. You seek the chalice, blood drinker? You seek salvation? Only the worthy may drink. Only the strong may rise. Step forward, and let the cairns judge you. Vorthar snarled. He was no weakling to be tested like some mewling whelp. He had bested warlords, carved through demons, slaughtered warriors beyond count. He was the test. But still, he moved cautiously. The wastes did not suffer arrogance lightly. A low growl echoed through the air. Not wind, not whispers. Something alive. Something waiting. Vorthar grinned, his blood beginning to boil. If the chalice was real, it would be his. If the cairns sought to test him, they would break before him. Either way, there would be blood. Chapter 4. The Hounds of the Gods. The Chaos Wastes were never silent. Even in the moments between battle, the land breathed. a roiling, seething expanse of nightmares given form. The sky churned with colors that should not exist, lightning arced between distant mountains that bled like open wounds, and the wind carried whispers, threats, and the maddened laughter of the damned. Vorthar pressed forward, the towering skull cairns looming ahead. The whispers of the Brazen Chalice still gnawed at the edges of his mind, drawing him deeper into the desolation. But the wastes were not without guardians. The Hounds of the gods had scented him. They always did. Vorthar knew he could never cross these lands unnoticed. He was a warlord with no warband, a champion with no master but bloodshed itself. The gods wove their own games, and their pawns were always eager to test their strength against one touched by Khorne's favor. And now they had come. A rustling sound slithered across the cracked ground. A diseased wheeze carried by the wind. The stench of rot thickened the air, bile and filth clinging to every breath. Then, like maggots bursting from a rotting carcass, they emerged. The followers of Grandfather Nurgle. From the fog of pestilence came a cavalcade of filth. Warriors swollen with tumors, their armor fused to their flesh by disease. Their weapons dripped with corruption, rusted blades oozing black pus. Their leader, a plague-bringer, whose bloated belly had split open to reveal writhing entrails, raised a rusted cleaver and bellowed. The blood god's hound walks alone. Come, brothers, let us embrace him in Grandfather's love. They surged forward. Vorthar did not retreat. With a growl of contempt, he charged. Gore fury met flesh, and flesh gave way like rotted parchment. He carved through the first warrior with a single blow, his axe shearing through bloated muscle and brittle bone. The second warrior swung a rusted mace at his head. Vorthar caught it mid-strike, crushing the man's wrist in his gauntleted grip before tearing his throat open with his axe. They came at him in droves, laughing, gurgling, thanking him even as he butchered them. It was not a battle. It was an execution. One by one, the plague-ridden fools fell, their bodies rupturing into clouds of putrid filth. Vorthar snarled as their rancid blood splattered against his armor. Even in death, they sought to defile him. When the last one collapsed in a heap of diseased flesh, silence settled. For a moment, then came the laughter. It slithered through the air like silk, rich with amusement, laced with venom. The shadows around him twisted, shifting into shapes that should not exist. From the darkness they came, Slanish's hunters. Where the Nurglites had been repulsive, these were beautiful in a way that was utterly wrong. Lithe warriors clad in gleaming silver and violet, their skins seemingly untouched by war. Their armor was crafted for pleasure, their weapons curved and wicked, meant to prolong suffering rather than end it. A woman, if she could even be called that, stepped forward, her body adorned with golden piercings, her face split by a grin that never quite reached her predatory eyes. "Such fury, such passion," she purred. "You waste it on mindless slaughter, little butcher. Come, let us show you a different kind of battle." The air around her shimmered, not with heat, but with something worse, a sensation that coiled around the mind, promising pleasure and agony entwined. Vorthar felt revulsion churn within him, not because of their appearance, nor their words, but because of the lie they represented. Khorne's fury was pure. Battle was pure. These creatures twisted war into something perverse, something lesser. They thought to tempt him. They would learn. With a roar, he leapt forward, Gore swinging in a crimson arc. The Slaaneshi warriors were fast, too fast. They danced around him, their movements fluid, their laughter mocking. Their blades kissed at the edges of his armor, cutting but never killing. They wanted him to suffer. Vorthar only had one response. He slaughtered them. His axe struck true, severing limbs, splitting skulls, Their laughter turned to screams, real screams, dying screams. Some moaned in ecstasy even as they fell, but he did not stop until none remained standing. He panted, his chest heaving, his body streaked with the blood of the fallen. But before he could press on, the air shifted again. And he knew. They were next. A wall of blue fire erupted before him. Reality twisted, ribbons of fate unraveling and reweaving around him. The laughter of Slaaneash's ilk was gone. Now only cold amusement remained. A sorcerer stepped forward, his form draped in robes of deepest sapphire. His face was hidden behind an intricate mask, his hands crackling with warp energy. "You are interesting, Butcher," the sorcerer mused. "Khorne's dogs rarely seek answers, yet here you are, seeking, searching." Vorthar gritted his teeth. He hated these ones most of all. The followers of Tzeentch did not fight for blood. They fought for knowledge, for schemes, for lies wrapped in prophecy. They did not care for the honor of battle, only the games they played in the dark. "You think you have a destiny, Bloodrot," the sorcerer mused, stepping closer. "You think you seek the chalice of your god's favor? Fool. You walk a path you cannot understand. You are already bound by fate." Vorthar felt his rage rising. "You speak too much." The sorcerer's head tilted. Then he smiled. "And you swing too much." The sky split open. A storm of warp fire crashed down upon him, twisting the air itself into a writhing nightmare. He charged, but the world shifted. One moment he was upon the sorcerer, the next he was somewhere else, as if time had folded in on itself. The warlock laughed. "Albany, do you see now, warrior?" Vorthar snarled. His vision was blurring, his rage coiling upon itself. He had killed so many already, more than he could count. And yet, for what? The Brazen Chalice? A whisper, a myth. He felt something stir in his chest. Doubt. A poison worse than any sorcery. But Khorne's fire burned it away. With a bellow of defiance, he charged one last time. He felt his axe connect, felt the crunch of bone, felt the storm break. And when the world settled, the sorcerer was gone. Silence. The battlefield was empty. Nurgle's rot, Slaaneash's whispers, Tzeentch's deceit. All fallen. Vorthar looked at the corpses, and for the first time in a long while, he felt nothing at all. He turned from the carnage, his path leading ever forward. The Brazen Chalice awaited, and he would claim it, no matter the cost. Chapter 5. The Price of Power. The temple stood like a rotting wound in the flesh of the chaos wastes. Once it had been a place of devotion, a monument raised by the hands of Khorne's most zealous followers, its walls carved with the names of 1,000 warlords who had spilled oceans of blood in their god's name. Now it was a ruin. Its great iron gates twisted and shattered, its once mighty pillars cracked and blackened, its halls littered with the bones of the warriors who had prayed here long ago. And something still lived within it. Vorthar stepped across the threshold, his boots crunching over the desiccated skulls of the fallen. The air reeked of old blood, the scent so thick it clung to his tongue like oil. The walls pulsed faintly, veins of molten brass coursing through the stone, as if the temple itself still breathed. He knew what waited inside. A demon, a creature of Khorne, bound to this place by a will stronger than its own. A thing of war and fury, caged within these walls by rites that only the most devoted could hope to unravel. And it knew of the Brazen Chalice. The whispers had led him here. The dead had spoken of it. The warlock's dying laughter had hinted at it. And so he had come. He stepped into the temple's shattered nave, its vaulted ceiling long since collapsed, allowing the crimson sky above to bleed its light into the chamber. At the center of the ruined hall, it was waiting. The demon was bound in chains of black iron, its massive form hunched beneath the weight of its imprisonment. It was monstrous, a colossus of muscle and brass, its body a thing of living metal and seething rage. 2 great horns curled from its head, and its hands, each tipped with claws like serrated blades, were stretched wide, shackled to the remains of an altar of skulls. Its eyes, burning coals set deep in a face like a beast's, snapped open the moment Vorthar entered. The word was a snarl, a promise of violence restrained only by the sorcery that bound it. The very sound of its voice shook the ground, dust spilling from the ruins above. Vorthar did not flinch. "I seek the Brazen Chalice," he said, his voice steady. "You will tell me where it lies." The demon's laughter was a grinding of metal, a war horn's bellow. "You seek power." It leaned forward as far as its chains would allow, its fanged maw twisting into something like a grin. "You seek to leash the rage that gnaws at your soul. But Khorne's gifts are never given freely, mortal." Vorthar tightened his grip on his axe. "Then I will take it." The demon's fiery gaze bored into him, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, it spoke again. "The chalice is real, but it is no gift. It is a test." Vorthar's breath came slow, measured. "Where?" The demon tilted its head, the chains groaning as it moved. "The Gore Spire." Vorthar's jaw clenched. He had heard the name before. All who walked the wastes had. The Gore Spire was a fortress lost to time, a place where the most fanatical of Khorne's worshippers had waged war against the gods themselves. It was said to be a monument to battle, a place where warriors did not die but fought forever, their souls bound to an eternity of endless slaughter. None who entered ever left. And at its heart, the Brazen Chalice waited. Vorthar took a step closer, his boots scraping against the blood-slicked stone. "What must I do?" The demon's grin widened, its tusks gleaming like the edges of 1,000 broken swords. "Bleed." With a roar, the chains snapped, not breaking, but tightening, dragging the demon back into the altar's grasp. The air ignited, flames bursting forth from the sigils that lined the floor, the scent of burning blood filling the chamber. Vorthar took a step back as the creature's body was wreathed in fire, its laughter echoing through the ruins. "Go forth, warrior. Seek the Gore Spire. Seek the chalice. But know this." The fire surged higher, the demon's form blurring into a thing of pure wrath, its voice turning into something vast, something more than a single creature's words. "You will not claim it without cost." The flames exploded outward, a shockwave of heat and fury, and Vorthar threw up his arm to shield his face. When the fire died away, the demon was gone. Only the whisper of laughter remained. Vorthar let out a slow breath. The Gore Spire. It was a name spoken in fear and reverence, a place where only the greatest warriors dared to tread. To reach it, he would have to cross the deepest parts of the wastes, through lands where reality itself was frayed, where demons prowled in endless war. And if he survived, if he stood within the Gore Spire's halls, then he would know if the Brazen Chalice was truly his salvation, or if it was only another trap of the gods. Without another word, he turned away from the ruins, stepping back into the wasteland. The path ahead was written in blood, and he would walk it. Chapter 6. The Forsaken Warband. The scent of blood always led to battle. Vorthar knew it before he saw the firelight on the horizon, before he heard the guttural roars of warriors locked in combat, before the rhythmic thunder of war drums pounded through the cracked earth of the chaos wastes. He had walked these lands long enough to recognize the signs. There was a warband nearby, and they were his kind, the butchers of Khorne, those who lived only to fight, to kill, to drown the world in carnage for the glory of the blood god. His jaw tightened as he crested a ridge of jagged rock, looking down upon the campsite of the warriors below. Great braziers of burning skulls cast a flickering red glow over the encampment, illuminating the brutal figures gathered within. Some were sharpening black iron axes, others branding fresh marks of Khorne into their scarred flesh. There were heads impaled on spears, banners soaked in the blood of the fallen, and the unmistakable scent of violence and reverence intertwined. These warriors were not just raiders. They were true followers of the blood god, and they had seen him. A murmur ran through the camp as eyes turned toward the figure standing on the ridge. Hushed whispers spread like fire. Some knelt in reverence, others clutched their weapons with shaking hands, as if witnessing something both divine and monstrous. One warrior, his armor adorned with the skulls of fallen champions, his face a tapestry of old scars, stepped forward. Bloodrot. The name hung in the air like an invocation, and the warriors erupted into a chorus of battle cries and war chants. Bloodrot, Bloodrot, the cursed one, the chosen of Khorne. Vorthar's fists clenched. He had seen this before. He had lived this before. The warband leader, a brute of a man, his body a fortress of chained plate and jagged spikes, approached, his voice thick with reverence and zealotry. "We know your name, Vorthar," he said, bowing his head in submission. "We have heard the tales. The warbands speak of you in whispers. The butcher of the Gorefang reavers, the one who has slain more than any mortal should." A second warrior, a woman with crimson-streaked war paint, her hands resting on the hilts of twin axes, spoke next. "The gods have chosen you. Khorne's fire burns within your soul, greater than any of us. We would fight at your side, Bloodrot." The warriors behind them bellowed in agreement, slamming their weapons against their shields, their bodies, anything to make the sound of war ring through the night. Vorthar remained still. This had happened before. Always it happened. The cursed wanderer walks alone. A warband finds him, seeks to follow him, to bask in his legend. They see only his strength, his glory, never the truth. They never understand what he is, what he has become. Vorthar looked down at them, his face unreadable, his grip tightened around Gorfury, the weight of the axe a reminder of the blood that would inevitably be spilled. "You do not know what you ask," he said, his voice cold as iron. The warband leader frowned. "We are warriors, Bloodrot. We know only battle. If Khorne has led us to you, then it is his will that we fight at your side." Vorthar exhaled slowly. "Khorne does not lead, he only watches." A flicker of hesitation passed over the warriors' faces, but zealotry is a blade that cuts deep. They would not abandon this so easily. The leader stepped forward. "You are marked by him. You are one of his greatest champions. We have fought for lesser warlords. We would follow you into any battle, into any slaughter." Vorthar's eyes narrowed. The memories came like a tide. The Gorefang reavers, once his brothers, reduced to lifeless husks by his own hands. The desperate shouts of warriors trying to restrain him as the red haze took hold. The final silence when the rage had faded and only the dead remained. He had tried this before. "You do not understand," he muttered. "I cannot lead you. I cannot keep you safe." The woman with the war paint spat onto the ground, her expression fierce and unwavering. "We do not seek safety, Bloodrot. We seek war." The warband roared again in agreement, hungry for blood, for battle, for a leader to bring them glory. Vorthar turned his gaze away. A leader. He had been that once, and the only thing he had ever led them to was death. But the hunger inside him stirred. The curse whispered. These warriors would not stop. They would follow him regardless. and if they did, they would die regardless. His bloodlust would consume them, just as it had consumed every warband before them. He could walk away, leave them to their fate, to find another leader, another battle. Or he could accept them, for a time, for a single war. He looked into their eyes, saw the burning devotion, the fury, the inevitable doom they did not yet see. "Then fight," he said at last. A roar erupted from the warband, their voices rising in battle cries and war hymns, their weapons raised high, their lust for blood and death unshaken. Vorthar said nothing. He knew the truth. It would not last. The slaughter always ended the same way. And when it did, he would be alone again. Chapter 7. Blood and Betrayal. The sky over the chaos wastes churned with stormfire, casting an eerie red glow over the battlefield. The ground was slick with filth and blood, a quagmire of bone and rotting flesh, as if the land itself had been wounded. The warbands stood at his back, their breath heavy with anticipation, their weapons slick with the blood of past battles. They had fought beside him once. They had stood in his shadow and roared his name. Now they would die for it. The chaos spawn lurked ahead, a monstrous abomination of twisted flesh and writhing limbs, once a warrior, now a grotesque mockery of life, reshaped by the unknowable will of chaos. It pulsed with unnatural energy, its many eyes rolling in madness, its mouths gibbering and screeching as it lurched forward, leaving a trail of steaming corruption in its wake. It was huge, its bloated form a writhing mass of flesh and bone, sprouting bladed appendages that lashed out like the talons of a god's mistake. The air shuddered with its unnatural presence, the ground itself rejecting it. Vorthar felt the familiar pull, the call to slaughter. "Blood rot," the warband's leader bellowed, his eyes gleaming beneath his iron helm. "What is your will?" Vorthar's grip tightened around Gore. "May fight," he growled. The warband charged. They crashed into the spawn like a storm of iron and flesh, their axes and blades biting deep, their war cries shaking the heavens. The abomination shrieked in fury, its twisted limbs snapping through armor, tearing warriors apart, sending broken bodies flying through the air like ragdolls. Vorthar roared and leapt into the fray. His axe tore through chitinous flesh, severing limbs, splitting bone, carving into the meat of madness itself. Blood sprayed across his armor, hot and thick with corruption, but he did not stop. The warband fought beside him, their devotion unyielding. They believed in him, in his legend. But belief did not change fate. And fate was cruel. The blood haze took him. It was always the same. At first it was exhilaration, his body surging with power, his strikes unstoppable, his vision sharp as a predator's. But then the faces blurred. The enemy, the allies, the warband, the spawn. The world faded into crimson, only movement, only bodies, only the blinding need to kill, to rip, to slaughter. Vorthar lost himself. His axe found flesh, and flesh split apart. Bodies fell around him, screaming, breaking, dying. And he did not care. The curse took him, wrapped him in its terrible embrace, whispered in his ear like a lover's breath. More. The warband tried to call to him. He did not hear. They tried to stop him. They could not. He felt their blades, their hands grasping at him, trying to restrain him, but they were weak, so easily torn apart, their skulls so fragile beneath his grip. Their blood filled his lungs, and he roared in ecstasy. Then silence. When the blood haze faded, the battlefield was still. The chaos spawn lay dead, its mangled corpse twitching, steam rising from its shredded remains. The warband was gone. No, not gone. They were here, around him, broken, lifeless. He saw the bodies, saw the ruined faces of the warriors who had knelt before him, who had sworn to follow him, who had placed their faith in him. His faithless hands had betrayed them. The leader, his skull shattered, his blade still buried in the dirt where he had made his last stand. The woman with the war paint, her eyes staring at the sky, her throat a ragged ruin beneath his axe. The others, their armor cleaved apart, their limbs scattered, their blood mixing with the filth of the wastes. And Vorthar stood alone. Again, the rage was gone. The ecstasy faded. All that remained was the emptiness. He knelt, his gauntleted fingers trailing over the blood-soaked dirt, feeling the weight of what he had done, what he had always done, what he would always do. He had warned them. They had not listened. And now they were nothing. The gods did not care. The wastes did not care. The blood god did not care. Vorthar exhaled, the sound hollow, and rose to his feet. His axe dripped with the blood of his own followers. It did not matter. None of it mattered. The Gore Spire awaited. He turned his back on the dead, on their foolish faith, on their broken devotion. And he walked, alone, as he always would. Chapter 8. The Eye of the Storm. The storm had been waiting for him. Vorthar had walked the chaos wastes long enough to know when the land itself was watching. The sky had darkened as he moved, shifting from blood-red twilight to a deep, unnatural violet, streaked with tendrils of lightning that never struck the ground. The air felt thick, wrong, like the silence before a battle cry. And then the storm broke. The wind screamed as a vortex of arcane fire erupted from the sky, tearing the land open in a maelstrom of raw magic. The ground split and buckled beneath him, warping and shifting like the flesh of a living thing, and from the center of the swirling chaos he emerged. Lord Arzakar, the sorcerer of Tzeentch, descended in a spiral of warp-touched energy, his flowing robes shifting between midnight blue and shimmering gold, his mask a thing of twisting metal and half-formed faces. He did not walk nor float. He simply moved, as though space itself folded around him. Vorthar knew the scent of sorcery, and he hated it. His axe was already in his hands. "I do not have time for your tricks, warlock." Arzakar tilted his masked head. His voice was calm, patient, like a teacher indulging an ignorant child. "And yet you stand in my presence." Vorthar snarled and lunged, gore fury cutting through the storm like a meteor of blood and iron. But Arzakar was not there. His form shimmered, breaking into 100 mirrored reflections, each moving in a different direction, laughing in a chorus of mockery. Vorthar roared, swinging wildly, shattering illusions like glass. But the real Arzakar remained untouched, circling him like a predator studying prey. "Such raw fury," the sorcerer mused. "Such unshackled violence. You are not a warrior, blood-wrought. You are a beast, a blade without a master." Vorthar's breath came in ragged huffs. He could feel the magic coiling around him, the storm pressing in, suffocating, warping, twisting. Then the warlock's voice changed. "You seek the Brazen Chalice." Vorthar froze. The storm calmed, just for a moment, as if waiting for his response. Arzakar's many reflections vanished, and now only one remained. He lowered his hands, stepping closer, his glowing eyes boring into Vorthar's soul. "You think it will save you?" Vorthar's grip on his axe tightened. "I think it will kill you if you do not tell me what you know." Arzakar chuckled. "Oh, blood-wrought. So predictable. That is why the gods love you." He paused, tilting his head. "But not why they fear you. Vorthar took a step forward, but before he could close the distance, Arzakar snapped his fingers. Reality shattered. Volthar's mind was torn from his body, thrust into a swirling maelstrom of visions, a battlefield of impossible scale, warriors fighting and dying for eternity, their bodies reforming with every death. At the center of the carnage, a massive chalice of brass and bone sat atop a tower of skulls, overflowing with blood that burned like molten gold. The Brazen Chalice. He felt it in his bones. It was not salvation. It was not an end to the curse. It was. With a bellow of defiance, Vorthar ripped himself free from the vision, the world snapping back into place around him. He was on his knees, Gore fury clutched in his shaking hands. The storm still raged, but Arzakar stood calmly above him, amused. "You saw it, didn't you?" Vorthar rose unsteadily, his heart pounded, the rage clawed at his mind, hungry, desperate, confused. The warlock had shown him something true, something he had not been meant to see. "Your journey is a lie, Bloodrot," Arzakar continued, stepping closer. "The chalice is no cure. It never was." Vorthar gritted his teeth. "Then what is it?" Arzakar smiled beneath his mask. "The final test. The last battlefield. A place where warriors do not die, but fight forever." The word sent a chill through Vorthar's blood. The Gore Spire. The fortress of eternal battle. The war without end. Arzakar raised a single long-fingered hand, magic crackling at his fingertips. "Come now, Bloodrot. You have seen the truth. Your path is meaningless. Let me free you." Vorthar growled. And then he moved. Not for battle, for escape. The warlock had stolen too much from his mind. He needed space, needed to think, needed to run. With a defiant roar, he turned and leapt from the ridge, plunging into the storm below, letting the winds carry him away. Arzakar did not chase him. He did not need to. The laughter that followed him said it all. Vorthar was already playing his part, whether he knew it or not. Chapter 9. The Howl of the Blood Beast. The red mire pulsed like a festering wound in the chaos wastes. It was not water that filled the swamp, nor even the sickly bile of Nurgle's plagues. It was blood, thick, endless, churning with the echoes of ancient battles long lost to time. The land itself drank of the fallen, and Khorne, the great and silent watcher, let it fester, let it thrive, let it hunger. Vorthar stood at its edge, his boots sinking into the wet, pulsing ground. The air was suffocating, thick with the scent of raw iron and decay. Every ripple on the bloodied surface sent whispers into the night, not voices, but the memory of screams, the howls of warriors whose bodies had sunk beneath the crimson tide. This was a place of offerings, a sanctuary of slaughter, a trial, and Khorne had set a guardian here. Vorthar could feel it watching. The blood beast, a creature of pure carnage, a manifestation of Khorne's eternal hunger, something not born from flesh, but from war itself. And he would have to kill it. He took a step forward, his boots submerging into the crimson swamp, the blood clutching at his legs like grasping hands. The mire groaned, and then it moved. A tremor rippled through the swamp, pulsing outward like the beating of a colossal heart. The blood churned, bubbling as something immense stirred beneath its surface. Then came the howl. It was not a sound, but a war cry, a roar that shook the sky, that sent shock waves of raw fury through the earth, that reverberated in his bones like the call of a god. And then it rose. The blood beast erupted from the red mire in a maelstrom of gore and ruin. It was colossal, a towering nightmare of flesh and brass, its body a fusion of demon and beast, of war and slaughter itself. A head like a hulking warhound, its maw filled with jagged iron fangs, its burning eyes locked onto him with a hunger that was not mindless, but ordained. Its body was a shifting mass of rippling muscle, its arms ending in blade-tipped talons, its back crowned with jagged brass spines that clattered with the weight of its power. Vorthar's blood ignited. He knew what this was. A test. Khorne did not speak. He did not guide. He did not promise. He tested. And this was his trial. With a snarl, Vorthar charged. The blood beast roared, surging forward like a living avalanche, its claws ripping through the swamp, sending waves of blood crashing in every direction. Vorthar dodged left, barely avoiding a swing that could have split a warband in two. He plunged Gore Fury into its side, the demon metal biting deep, but the beast did not slow. Instead it laughed. A deep, guttural sound, not of mockery, but of approval. The blood beast wanted this. It wanted battle. Vorthar grinned through bared teeth. So be it. The fight was brutal. The blood beast swung, and Vorthar met it blow for blow. His axe tore through its hide, but the demon's flesh was not meant to break easily. It healed even as he carved it open, its body shifting, adapting to his strikes, learning his attacks. He had seconds before it became an unstoppable force. Then it lunged, faster than something its size should be. Its jaws clamped onto his shoulder, piercing armor, tearing into flesh, its hot breath like a furnace against his skin. Pain ripped through him. But pain meant nothing. With a bellow, Vorthar drove his gauntleted fist into the creature's eye, crushing the burning orb with a sickening squish. The blood beast shrieked, its body recoiling in fury. Vorthar pressed the attack. He ripped his axe free, swinging it in a two-handed arc, the force of the blow splitting open the beast's snout, sending gouts of molten blood spraying across the swamp. The blood beast staggered, its head snapping to the side. This was his moment. Vorthar leapt, driving Gore Fury into the beast's neck with all his strength, feeling the metal bite into Daemon bone, feeling its fury, its strength, its rage pour into him as it howled. Then he twisted. The beast's throat split open, a gaping wound spilling endless rivers of burning ichor, its final scream shaking the mire. Then, silence. The blood beast collapsed, its massive body crashing into the swamp, sending one last wave of blood spilling outward. Vorthar pulled his axe free, breathing hard, his body slick with both his blood and the beast's. Then something shifted. The mire stilled, its whispers silent for the first time in eternity. Vorthar felt the presence of Khorne, not a voice, not a command, but a weight upon him, a force that acknowledged what had been done here. The blood beast had been slain, and Vorthar had proven himself. The way forward was clear. He did not kneel, he did not bow. He simply turned away from the corpse and marched forward. The Gore Spire waited, and he would claim his destiny in blood. Chapter 10. The Gore Spire Unveiled. The Gore Spire loomed on the horizon like a wound torn into the world. It was not built, it had grown, a towering monument of war-forged madness, of stone fused with bone, of iron blackened by centuries of slaughter. The sky above it boiled with crimson clouds, thick with the howls of warriors who had died screaming beneath its walls. The land around it was slick with rivers of blood, trenches filled with the rivers of blood, trenches filled with the remains of the unworthy, their skulls packed together in grotesque walls that marked the fortress's boundary. Vorthar stood at its gates, or what could be called gates. They were not doors, not barriers, but an endless battlefield. The moment he set foot past the threshold, he felt it. The war here never stopped. All around him warriors fought, died and rose again, an endless carnage without pause, without mercy, without purpose, but slaughter itself. He watched as a warrior clad in brass armor was cleaved in half, his body crumpling into the mud, only for his flesh to reknit, his bones to snap back into place, his lifeless eyes to flare with fury once more. He rose, roared, and threw himself back into the fray, his blade hungry for blood once more. There was no victory here. There was no ending. Only war without cease. And at its heart, upon the highest peak of the Gore Spire, sat the Brazen Chalice. Vorthar's hands clenched into fists. It was real. It was here. But to claim it, he would have to pass the final trial. A deep tremor shook the air, and the battlefield around him stilled, just for a moment. Then came the laughter, a thunderous guttural bellow echoing from above. The very air shook, and the blood-soaked ground trembled beneath his boots. Warriors froze mid-strike, their battle lust momentarily overwhelmed by something greater. Then he descended. A shadow fell across the battlefield, and the bloodthirster landed with an earth-shattering impact. The current lord of the Gore Spire. He was monstrous, a towering engine of carnage, his body forged from sinew and brass, his veins pulsing with molten fury, his wings spread wide, blotting out the sickly crimson sky, and in his hands he carried a whip of fire and an axe the size of a siege weapon. His head was the skull of a beast, his eyes pits of endless rage, and from his throat came a growl that cracked the stone beneath him. Vorthar met his gaze. The bloodthirster grinned, fangs glistening with the blood of 1,000 slain champions. "You seek the chalice, mortal." His voice was a war drum, a war cry given form, shaking the very bones within Vorthar's body. Vorthar raised Gore fury, his stance unshaken. "I will take it." The bloodthirster laughed again, the sound rolling across the battlefield like a storm of slaughter. "Then take it from me." The warriors of the Gore Spire stepped back, forming a circle of death, giving them space for the final duel. Vorthar braced himself. This was the moment. This was the test. The bloodthirster lifted his axe, its edge burning with the raw hatred of Khorne himself. Then, with a roar that split the heavens, he charged, and Vorthar ran to meet him. Chapter 11. The Lord of the Spire. The earth split beneath his feet as Valzareth, the crimson wrath, came forward, his every step a thunderous quake of raw power. The air burned around him, a maelstrom of searing rage and divine fury, his very presence twisting the battlefield into a forge of slaughter. Vorthar stood unshaken, gripping Gore fury so tightly his gauntlets groaned under the strain. Before him loomed the greatest test of his existence, the final barrier between him and the Brazen Chalice. A bloodthirster of the first host. A demon that had stood at the right hand of Khorne himself, who had waged war for thousands of years, drowning entire realms in blood and fire. Not a servant, but a warlord of the blood god in his own right. And Vorthar would have to kill him. The circle of warriors surrounding them fell silent, their eternal battle momentarily forgotten. No mortal champion had ever dared challenge Valzareth. None had ever left the Gore Spire after trying. The bloodthirster's burning eyes locked onto him, glowing pits of malice and hunger. His wings spread wide, casting shadows like the outstretched arms of death itself. His massive axe, Rageborn, was forged from the melted weapons of 100 failed challengers, its blade wreathed in fire that had never dimmed. "You are bold, mortal." Valzareth's voice was a war horn, shaking the very bones of the fortress. "And blind," Vorthar snarled, lifting his axe. "I am neither." Valzareth laughed, a sound deeper than the war cries of entire armies, sending shockwaves across the blood-soaked battlefield. "You think you fight for salvation, for control, But you are already lost, Bloodrot. The demon gestured to the Brazen Chalice, visible high upon its monument of skulls atop the Gore Spire. The cup overflowed, blood cascading endlessly from its brim, the air around it humming with power. You seek it because you believe it will grant you mastery over your curse. The bloodthirster took another step forward, his clawed feet crushing the broken remains of lesser warriors beneath him. But you have already failed. Vorthar's muscles tensed. I have not yet fought you, the demon grinned. You misunderstand, mortal. He lifted Rageborn, the fire of the axe flaring brighter, the heat so intense, the iron beneath them began to melt. The test is not survival. Vorthar's breath slowed, his body coiled like a predator ready to strike. Valzera's grin widened, his fangs gleaming in the firelight. The test is your will. And then he charged. The ground shattered beneath him, blood and molten rock erupting in his wake, his axe swinging with the force of an avalanche. Vorthar leapt back, the blade cleaving the earth where he had stood, sending shock waves that tore the battlefield apart. He could feel the air itself split from the force of the swing. Had it connected, he would have been nothing but red mist. No hesitation, no fear. Vorthar lunged forward, swinging Gawfury in a brutal arc. The axe bit deep into the bloodthirster's side, carving through demon flesh, spraying black-hot ichor into the air. Valzereth roared, more in approval than pain, his massive hand snapping out like a lightning strike. Vorthar barely rolled aside, but the demon's wings snapped open, catching him mid-dodge, sending him hurtling through the battlefield. He crashed against a jagged pillar of skulls, the impact sending bones cascading to the ground. The warriors of the Gore Spire howled in bloodlust, but they did not interfere. This was a duel of gods and monsters. Vorthar spat blood, pushing himself upright just in time to see Valzereth charging again. "Fights, mortal," the demon bellowed. "Show me if you are worthy of Khorne's gaze." The battle raged. Blow after blow, axe met axe, sparks of divine fury igniting the sky. Vorthar moved with desperation and fury, his strikes precise, savage, unrelenting. But Valzereth was faster than he should be, his movements impossibly fluid for something so massive, his attacks designed not just to kill, but to break his opponent's spirit. This was not a simple test of strength. This was an execution. And yet, Vorthar did not yield. Even as his armor cracked, even as his body bled, even as his vision blurred from the sheer force of the battle, he kept swinging. Because he could not stop. Because he had nothing else left but the fight. Because this was all he had ever been. Valzereth grinned through the carnage, his massive frame steaming with ichor, his wounds already sealing shut. "You fight well, Bloodrot." The demon's wings flared, his presence looming even greater over the battlefield. "But will alone does not grant victory. Not against me." Then, his hand shot out, catching Gawfury mid-swing, stopping it cold. Vorthar snarled, struggling against the demon's crushing grip, but Valzereth wrenched the weapon from his hands, sending it spinning through the air, embedding it in the far wall of the Gore Spire. Unarmed, vulnerable, the bloodthirster loomed closer, his massive shadow falling over him, the heat of his axe searing the very air between them. "Do well, mortal." He swung, and Vorthar moved. With a roar of pure defiance, he lunged at the bloodthirster, his bare hands gripping the demon's burning wrist, his flesh sizzling from the heat, but he did not care. With one final burst of strength, he drove his knee into the demon's gut, sending a shockwave through the battlefield, forcing the colossus to falter. Vorthar ripped the axe from his grasp, spun, and buried it in the demon's throat. The world stilled. For a moment there was only silence. Then Valzereth let out a guttural, rattling snarl, his massive body shuddering, the fires in his eyes dimmed but not extinguished. "Zah," the demon rumbled, his grin never fading. "Now you understand." His body began to collapse, turning to smoldering embers, breaking apart like a shattered war banner in the wind. But his laughter remained. Vorthar stood, breathing hard, watching as the bloodthirster of the first host faded into oblivion. And then the warriors of the Gore Spire knelt. The Brazen Chalice was his to claim, but at what cost? Chapter 12. Battle in the Shadow of the Brass Throne. The Brazen Chalice waited atop its monument of skulls, but Vorthar was not alone. The warriors of the Gore Spire, eternal in their slaughter, still knelt at the edges of the battlefield where Valzareth had fallen. Their silence was not reverence, it was anticipation. They had seen this before, for none who reached the chalice left the same. Vorthar climbed the cracked, blood-soaked steps toward the chalice's perch, his breath ragged, his body aching with the wounds of his duel with the bloodthirster. His fingers tightened around Gore Fury, the weight of the demon metal axe heavier than it had ever felt before. But there was another weight, one he had not yet acknowledged. A pulling, a whisper, not in words, but in need. The hunger, the curse. His vision blurred at the edges, and for the first time since his ascension as a warlord of Khorne, Vorthar felt something that should not exist within him. I doubt. Then the air shifted. The ground trembled. The sky darkened, not from clouds, but from something deeper. And the chalice moved. No, it was lifted by a hand not of mortal flesh. From the darkness, something rose, a colossus of demon flesh and brass, its body twisted by Khorne's fury, its form ever-changing, a living war, a monstrosity of the blood god's unfiltered wrath. Not just a demon, not just a champion, a manifestation of war itself, the brass throne's executioner, the final guardian of the chalice. It roared, and the very Gore Spire trembled. The blood rivers raged, and the kneeling warriors of the Spire rose once more, drawn into the maelstrom of its fury. It was not here to fight. It was here to end him. Vorthar's grip tightened, his breath slowed. This was his last battle. Either he conquered the chalice, or it consumed him. The guardian demon lunged. Vorthar met it in kind. Titans war. The impact of their clash split the battlefield apart. Vorthar's axe met the demon's warglaive, the force sending a shockwave through the ruins, shattering stone and bone alike. Warriors were torn from their feet, their bodies caught in the maelstrom, but Vorthar did not see them. He saw only his enemy. The demon struck again, its blades singing with the blood of the fallen, its movements impossibly fast for its size. Vorthar dodged left, but the whip-like tendrils of the creature's flesh lashed out, ripping into his armor, tearing at his exposed flesh. Pain surged through his body, but it meant nothing. Pain was a lie. Pain was weakness. He roared, turning his momentum into fury, spinning Gothgru in a savage arc, driving it deep into the demon's side. Its flesh split apart, molten ichor spewing across the battlefield, but the beast did not slow. Instead, it laughed. Laughed, and Vorthar felt the hunger grow stronger. The curse clawed at him, the bloodlust welling up inside, his vision shaking as the haze took root again. No, he clenched his teeth, fighting the pull, forcing himself to focus, to control it. But Khorne did not grant restraint. Only destruction. The demon lunged again, and this time Vorthar did not dodge. He embraced it. The cost of power. The battle blurred into madness. Time lost meaning. There was only movement. Only blood. Only war. He felt himself slipping. The axe in his hands was heavier, his own strength burning through him like a forge of rage, his bones screaming, his flesh tearing beneath the raw fury of Khorne's gaze. And he let go. The rage took him. Gore fury sang in his hands, the demon blade craving the carnage, drinking the blood of the guardian, its runes glowing with something deeper than fire. Vorthar was faster. Vorthar was stronger. He was not himself anymore. He was rage. He was slaughtered. He was Khorne's wrath made flesh. The demon struck. Vorthar ripped its arm from its body. The demon roared in fury. Vorthar split its chest open with a single strike. It collapsed, writhing, broken, its immortal body fighting against death, but there was no escape. Vorthar stood over it, Gore fury raised high. The final blow was his. As he looked down, he saw something else, the reflected horror in the demon's eyes, not of its own death, but of him. And in that moment, he saw himself, not as a man, not as a warrior, but as a monster. His body distorted, his armor twisted, his skin blackened with the taint of raw slaughter, his veins filled not with blood, but with war itself. He was not winning. He was becoming. He was losing his soul. The demon laughed, even as it died. "Ah, you see." Vorthar hesitated, but it was too late. The curse had taken root. He had won the battle. But had he already lost everything else? The Brazen Chalice awaited. But now he knew. If he drank, there would be no turning back. He was standing at the edge of eternity, and he no longer knew which path to take. Chapter 13. The Brazen Chalice Revealed. The Brazen Chalice pulsed with malign intent, perched atop the monument of skulls at the Gore Spire's peak. It was larger than he had imagined, wrought from Daemon-forged brass, its rim engraved with runes of slaughter, its basin filled to the brim with blood that seethed and churned as though alive. The warriors of the Gore Spire knelt in silence, watching him. Their eternal battle paused. The sky above burned, as though the heavens themselves had split open to witness this moment. Vorthar stood before the chalice, Gore fury dripping with the ichor of the fallen, his breath ragged, his body aching from the titanic duel with Valzereth, the Crimson Wrath. But the real battle had just begun. The Brazen Chalice called to him. It was not whispered temptation, nor the deception of sorcery. It was a command, a test, a final offering to the blood god. Vorthar's hand trembled as he reached forward. His blood was still boiling from the fight, the hunger still roaring in his veins. He had felt the curse tightening its grip on his soul with each swing of his axe, with each kill, with each moment of ecstasy and agony intertwined. And now he stood before the thing that could end it, or consume him completely. The first taste of damnation. His fingers closed around the chalice's rim. It was warm, not the heat of metal left in the sun, but the heat of flesh, of life, pulsing beneath his grip. The blood within swirled violently, as though it knew him, as though it awaited his devotion. One drink? That was all it would take. One sip, and he would control the bloodlust. He would be master of his fury, not its slave. One drink, and he hesitated, and the chalice laughed. A deep, guttural sound, not from the artifact itself, but from everywhere at once. It echoed through the Gore Spire, through the bones of the dead, through the warriors kneeling in silence, through the very sky above. Vorthar's grip tightened, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. Something was wrong. He had thought the chalice would be a gift, but Khorne does not grant gifts. Khorne only demands. The blood churned faster, a vortex of molten red twisting within the basin. The runes along the chalice's edge flared, shifting, rearranging, their meaning revealing itself at last. And Vorthar understood. This was not salvation. This was a trap. The chalice would not grant him control. It would feed the hunger. It would strip away the last vestiges of his soul, reducing him to nothing but rage, nothing but blood, nothing but war itself. He had come seeking a cure, but the only cure was death, or devotion. This was the final test, not of strength, but of faith. The blood god cared not from whence the blood flowed, but he did care that it flowed without hesitation, without doubt, without fear. And now, Vorthar stood at the edge of oblivion. The blood within the chalice rose, defying gravity, tendrils of crimson mist curling toward him, wrapping around his arms, his chest, his throat, slithering toward his lips. It wanted him. To drink, to become, to surrender. His muscles tensed. He was no coward. He had slain warbands, champions, Daemons. He had survived wars that would have torn lesser men apart. But this was different. This was his soul. This was his very being. If he drank, he would never walk away from battle again. He would become a living storm, a creature of war itself, a thing that never stopped killing, never stopped hungering, never stopped seeking the next fight, the next kill, the next slaughter. He would never be free. And the worst part? He was not sure if he cared anymore. The blood mist reached his lips. And Vorthar, he gripped the chalice tighter, and he made his choice. Chapter 14. The Wrath of the Blood God. The Gore Spire trembled. Not from battle, not from the fury of mortal warriors or the warring of demons, but from something greater, from Khorne himself. Vorthar stood before the Brazen Chalice, his breath ragged, his body broken from the trials, his soul teetering on the precipice. He could still feel the hunger clawing at him like a rabid beast, its presence coiling around his mind, urging him to drink, to surrender, to become. The blood within the chalice boiled, a living storm of rage and war, tendrils of crimson mist reaching toward him, wrapping around his chest, his throat, his lips, desperate to claim him. But then, the sky split apart. A deep, shuddering tremor cracked through the Gore Spire, the great monument of Gore groaning like a dying god. Blood spilled from the walls, rivers of gore crashing down into the battlefield below, the eternal warriors scattering like insects beneath an earthquake. And then there was only silence. Vorthar felt it before he saw it, a presence beyond mortal comprehension, beyond even daemonhood. A weight, a force, a god. The brass throne of Khorne was not in the realm of men, nor even within the twisted depths of the warp. It was a monument that transcended time and space, a great seat of judgment, forged from the bones of 1 billion warriors, its surface slick with the endless blood spilled in Khorne's name. And now, for the first time, Khorne watched him. The storm of his presence burned through Vorthar's skull, his vision warping, darkening, and in the depths of the collapsing spire, he saw a figure, a presence, an entity of war incarnate. Khorne did not whisper like Tzeentch, nor did he tempt like Slaanesh. He did not rot and spread like Nurgle's gifts. He simply was, a god of slaughter and conquest, of war unending and blood eternal. And now he spoke, not in words, not in whispers, but in truth. Vorthar staggered back, his body screaming in agony, his soul laid bare before the blood god's gaze. And then the choice was given. A booming decree, a presence that filled the skies, that drowned out all other sound, that made the very blood in his veins burn with divine power. Great. The command was absolute. If he drank, if he accepted the chalice's gift, he would be remade, no longer mortal, no longer flesh and bone, but something greater. A Daemon prince of Khorne, an eternal avatar of the blood god's fury, a warrior without limits, without weakness, without doubt. The bloodlust would never leave him. The hunger would never fade. He would kill until the stars burned away. He would wage war until reality itself crumbled. And when all things had fallen before Khorne's wrath, he would stand atop a mountain of skulls that stretched beyond the cosmos, forever in battle, forever in rage, forever in slaughter. It was the highest honor, the ultimate ascension. And yet, there was another path. The blood god spoke again. Refuse. And he would be nothing. A warrior who denied his nature was no warrior at all. A servant of Khorne who feared the final battle was not worthy of Khorne's gaze. To refuse the gift was to be cast aside, forgotten, erased. Khorne's champions did not walk away from war. They died upon the battlefield, or they became eternal. There was no third path. No peace, no salvation. Only ascension or oblivion. Vorthar's grip on the chalice tightened. He could feel the power within, the strength, the immortality, the promise of endless war. Every fiber of his being screamed to accept it, to become what he was meant to be. And yet, something inside him fought back. Not fear, not cowardice, but something else, something deeper. A memory, a battlefield long ago, the first warband he had ever led, the first men who had followed him, not because they feared him, but because they believed in him. He had lost them, to his own hands, just as he had lost every warband since. He had become a storm of violence, a weapon that could not be held, tamed, or followed. The truth was clear now. The chalice had never been the cure. It had been the final step in his journey, not to freedom, but to eternal servitude. Was that what he truly wanted? To fight forever, with no end, no choice, no will beyond Khorne's demand, to be nothing but war? His grip shook. His breath was ragged. And then he made his choice. The Gore spire rumbled, the very realm of chaos trembling at his decision. The storm above ignited, the warriors of the Spire howling in rage, in exultation, in madness, as Khorne's final judgment fell upon him. Vorthar had chosen his fate, and the blood god watched. Chapter 15. The Sorcerer's Deception. The world trembled as Vorthar stood on the precipice of damnation. The brazen chalice pulsed in his grip, the blood within seething, alive with malice, demanding to be claimed. Khorne's presence bore down upon him, a pressure heavier than any battlefield, a god's gaze fixed upon his soul. The choice had been given: ascension or annihilation. Vorthar's muscles coiled, his breath ragged, his mind racing between the only two fates before him. And then a voice slithered through the blood-drenched air. Such a simple creature, standing before such a simple choice. The storm above twisted, the sky fracturing, and from the swirling maelstrom of madness, he stepped forth. Lord Azikar, the sorcerer of Tzeentch, the weaver of lies, the schemer who had watched and waited, knowing this moment would come. He descended like a shadow upon the battlefield, his robes shifting and writhing, his mask a shifting mosaic of ever-changing faces, each whispering secrets to those foolish enough to listen. His staff glowed with twisting sorcery, its surface etched with symbols that did not belong in this world. Vorthar's grip on Gore fury tightened. "You dare to crawl here, warlock," he snarled. "This is no place for cowards who hide behind spells." Azikar laughed, the sound silk and venom intertwined. Bloodrot. I have never hidden. I have simply waited, and now—" He gestured toward the chalice, toward Khorne's judgment hanging in the air. Now, the moment is perfect. The air grew cold, despite the fire still burning in the sky. Vorthar's instincts screamed. This was wrong. Arzakar had not come for war. He had come for something far worse. A plan years in the making. You think Khorne's will is absolute? Arzakar continued, stepping forward, his form never quite the same from one moment to the next, as though he existed in every possibility at once. You think your god has granted you a choice. But tell me, Bloodrod. His many eyes, hidden behind shifting masks, gleamed with something deeper than amusement. What if I told you this was never your choice at all? Vorthar snarled, his rage building, but the warlock lifted a hand, as if silencing a child. Consider, warrior, how many battles have you fought that you did not seek? How many times have you felt the path beneath your feet move, shift, push you toward the Brazen Chalice? How many whispers, how many omens, how many visions led you here? Vorthar's breath caught for a fraction of a second. He had felt it, the way the battlefield always called to him, how the whispers had always come at the right time, guiding him here, toward this moment. It had always felt like fate. But whose? Arzakar's mask twisted into something resembling a smile. You think this is Khorne's will? He purred. You think the blood god would ever grant you control? Vorthar's fists clenched. What are you saying? The sorcerer chuckled, and with a flick of his staff, the brazen chalice shuddered in Vorthar's grip, its blood rising in tendrils, writhing as though awakening from slumber. I am saying, Bloodrod, that the brazen chalice was never about devotion, never about proving yourself to Khorne, never about ascension. The blood within the chalice flared, and for the first time Vorthar saw what lay beneath its surface. A prison, a trap of divine making. His curse had never been a flaw. It had been a ritual, a binding. Khorne's greatest weapons are not his daemon princes, Arzakar continued, his voice a snake winding around Vorthar's mind. Not his champions, nor his warbands. They are his beasts, his chains of endless destruction, his eternal storms of slaughter. The truth clawed at the edges of his mind. The brazen chalice did not grant power. It amplified it. It burned away all will, all thought, all reason. Those who drank did not ascend. They became eternal avatars of destruction, nothing more than unshackled avatars of endless, mindless war, thrown into the battlefields of eternity to wage war without cause, without end, without ever stopping. A curse with no cure, and he had been led here, like a beast herded toward slaughter. His vision blurred, his blood boiling with a rage that was no longer his own. Arzakar's mask shifted once more, his tone turning triumphant, gloating. You see it now, don't you? He stepped forward, voice laced with honeyed deceit. Khorne does not offer salvation. He never did. But his many eyes gleamed like dying stars. Again, Vorthar's body tensed. What? Arzakar smiled, stretching his arms wide as if to embrace him. Khorne would turn you into a beast, a thing of unrelenting war. I, however, his voice became silk, a whisper of endless possibilities. I can give you something greater, power beyond rage, strength beyond bloodlust, a mind sharpened by knowledge rather than dulled by slaughter. He gestured, and the air split apart, revealing visions of conquered realms, of stars burned to cinders, of legions of warriors bowing in reverence to a single figure, a figure clad in darkened brass, his face twisted in a mask of fire and war, a blade in one hand, sorcery in the other. He could be more than Khorne's beast, Vorthar. The ground trembled beneath him, the warlock's whispers crawling into his mind. "Join me. Let me sever your chains, and together we shall reshape the battlefield, not as Khorne's pawns, but as masters of war itself." The world seemed to tilt. The brazen chalice throbbed in his hands, his vision clouded with both rage and revelation. He had come here for salvation. And now he stood between two forms of damnation. Would he surrender to Khorne's will, become the storm of slaughter, lost to his own bloodlust for eternity? Or would he betray the blood god, cast aside his chains, only to forge new ones in the grip of a schemer's deceit? The sorcerer's hand was outstretched. The chalice pulsed in his grip, and Vorthar knew that the next moment would define his eternity. Chapter 16. Chains of Fate. Vorthar roared as unseen chains clamped down upon his soul. Azakar's laughter was a serpent's hiss, coiling around him, weaving its venomous grip deeper into his being. The brazen chalice pulsed in his hands, the blood within writhing like a living thing, a storm of rage, hunger, and something far worse. Vorthar's vision blurred, his mind drowning in two warring forces. On one side, the eternal hunger of Khorne, the promise of unshackled slaughter, of war without end, of becoming the ultimate instrument of the blood god's fury. On the other, Arzakar's offer, a different kind of chain, forged not of rage but of knowledge and cunning, an eternity of conquest not as a mindless beast, but as a warlord, wielding both blade and sorcery. Two paths, neither his own. Chains. No matter which path he chose, he would be enslaved, a puppet to Khorne's rage, or a tool in the warlock's grand deceit. But Vorthar Bloodrot did not kneel. Not to gods. Not to sorcerers. Not to fate itself. The struggle within. He felt Azakar's magic sinking deeper, tendrils of warp energy digging into his flesh, into his mind, into his very essence, pulling at him, rewriting him, twisting him into something lesser, something obedient. "Let go, Bloodrot," the warlock's voice slithered through his mind. "You are already lost. There is no choice but to serve. Accept your fate." Now, the blood within the brazen chalice boiled, rising like tendrils of living flame, its whispers growing louder, urging him to drink, to embrace, to surrender. "You were made for this," came the wordless decree of Khorne. "There is no other path." Vorthar's fingers twitched, his grip on Gore Fury faltered, his knees buckled. It would be so easy. To let go, to drink and be reborn, to cast aside the burden of choice, to become one with the war eternal, or to give in to the warlock's deception, to wield power beyond rage, to become a conqueror not bound to slaughter, but to the great game of war itself. But deep inside him, something burned. Not rage, not power, something older, something that had kept him standing when all others had fallen. His will, the same will that had carried him through war after war. The same will that had refused to kneel when others begged for mercy. The same will that had rejected both gods and masters alike. The warlock's magic tightened. The chalice's pull strengthened. But so did he. His teeth clenched, his muscles tensed, and with a snarl of pure defiance, he pushed back. A warrior's struggle was never against the blade before him, but the one within himself. He had fought for years to hold back the hunger, to control it, to resist becoming the beast his god wished him to be. And now he would fight, one last time, for himself. Breaking the chains, Vorthar threw his head back and roared, not in rage, but in defiance. The magic tightening around his soul cracked. Arzakar staggered back, his sorcerer unraveling, his many faces twisting in confusion and fury. The brazen chalice trembled in his grip, the blood inside twisting into wild, thrashing tendrils, desperate, pleading, howling. And that he crushed it. With one final act of defiance, Vorthar squeezed the chalice in his grasp, his gauntleted fingers digging into the demon-forged brass, shattering it into molten shards. The blood within shrieked, a sound of rage and agony that tore through the battlefield, an explosion of crimson fire erupting from his hands, sending shockwaves of divine fury rippling across the Gore spire. The sky itself split open. The warriors of the spire reeled, collapsing under the weight of the disruption, the brazen chalice's destruction shaking the very foundation of Khorne's domain. And in that moment, he was free. The fall of the warlock. Arzakar staggered, his robes torn by the force of the backlash, his mask cracking, revealing the warped, many-eyed horror beneath. "You fool!" he shrieked, his voice no longer calm, no longer amused, but filled with raw panic. "Do you even understand what you have done? You could have been—" Vorthar moved. Before the sorcerer could utter another word, Gore fury cleaved through the air. The demon axe met Arzakar's body, carving through sorcery and flesh alike, severing the warlock's head from his shoulders in a single brutal stroke. The sorcerer's corpse twisted, his body melting into a writhing storm of chaotic energy, his final shriek lost in the winds of the collapsing Gore spire. Vorthar stood over the remains, his breath ragged, his body broken, but his will unshaken. He had denied Khorne. He had denied Tzeentch. He had denied the gods themselves. The wrath of the blood god. The earth beneath him split. The Gore spire crumbled, the battlefield breaking apart, as though the world itself could not comprehend what had just transpired. And then Khorne's presence was upon him, and not in whispers, not in deception, but in rage. A god's fury manifested, not through words, not through magic, but through the weight of his rejection, the sheer audacity of Vorthar's defiance. The black god had offered him eternity, and he had thrown it aside. The brass throne trembled in the distant void, the roar of Khorne's displeasure shaking the heavens, his judgment descending upon the mortal who had dared to refuse him. The warriors of the Gore spire fled, for even they feared what was coming. Vorthar stood alone, his body shaking, his breath unsteady, his soul bare. He had no warband, no god to follow, no path forward. Only the rage of the blood god, bearing down upon him, preparing to wipe his existence from the annals of history. And yet, as the ground collapsed beneath him, as the sky burned, as the world itself sought to erase him, Vorthar grinned. If Khorne sought to strike him down, so be it. But he would not kneel. Not to gods. Not to fate. Not to anyone. Chapter 17. The Fall of the Gore spire. The Gore spire screamed, not in the way a man screams in battle, nor in the way a warhound howls before a kill. It screamed like a dying god, like a monument to war that had been denied its final offering. The fortress was crumbling, the very stones splitting apart, blood pouring from the walls like an open wound, molten brass gushing from its foundations. The warriors who had fought and died here for eternity, those who had been bound to Khorne's will, slaughtering one another in an endless cycle, were breaking apart, their forms unraveling, as if their existence had only ever been a dream of battle made real. The sky turned black. The ground shuddered beneath Vorthar's feet, and still the wrath of Khorne loomed above him. The blood god had watched. The blood god had offered. And Vorthar had refused. Now there was no mercy, only destruction. The escape. The brazen chalice lay in the ruins, shattered by his own hands, its power spent, its deception revealed. It was nothing but a trap, a means of turning him into a mindless engine of war, a tool that would never stop killing, never stop fighting, never stop hungering. But Vorthar was no one's tool. Not Khorne's, not the Warlock's, not Fate's. And so, as the Gore Spire burned, he ran. Not in fear, not cowardice, but in defiance. The fortress collapsed around him, spires of brass and bone shattering, rivers of blood flooding the walkways, corpses burning away as Khorne's judgment erased everything in his path. The very walls of the fortress became weapons, jagged spikes of iron bursting from the stone, seeking to impale him, to hold him here, to keep him trapped in Khorne's domain forever. But he was faster. A warrior's instincts were sharper than steel, stronger than fate. Vorthar ducked beneath a falling slab of iron, the impact sending a shockwave of dust and gore into the air. He leapt across a collapsing bridge, the blood river below boiling with divine fury, reaching like hands desperate to pull him down into oblivion. A wall of fire erupted ahead, a final barrier, a last trial to break him. Vorthar did not stop. With a roar that shook his own bones, he charged through the flames, his armor searing, his flesh scorching, but his mind never faltering. Pain was nothing. Only the will to survive mattered. Only his freedom mattered. Through the fire, through the collapsing ruin, through the howling judgment of a god denied his prize, Vorthar emerged. The final trial. The exit loomed ahead, the great gates of the Gore Spire, once impenetrable now, hanging open, shattered by Khorne's wrath. But before he could reach them, a shadow fell upon him. The sky itself cracked, and from the storm of brass and blood a figure emerged. Not immortal, not a demon, but a piece of Khorne's own wrath made flesh. A greater Daemon, a herald of the blood god, descended with the force of an entire war host, its body wreathed in divine flame, its armor forged from the fury of the battlefield itself. Its eyes burned with Khorne's displeasure. It raised a colossal axe, its voice shaking the world. You dare defy the blood god? Vorthar did not stop moving. The demon swung, a blow meant to split him in half, to reduce him to nothing but a forgotten smear on the battlefield. But Vorthar was no longer a pawn of the blood god. He dodged beneath the strike, feeling the wind of the demon's axe graze his face, searing the skin from his cheek, but he did not falter. With a final burst of strength, he drove forward, gore fury cleaving through the demon's leg, its molten blood erupting in a spray of fire and ichor. The creature staggered, howling in rage, but Vorthar was already past it. He raced through the gates, the storm collapsing behind him, the weight of Khorne's fury tearing the Gore Spire apart. The last thing he saw as he crossed the threshold was the fortress imploding, the eternal battlefield within erased in a single cataclysm of divine wrath. Freedom. The chaos storm broke. The sky cleared, and for the first time in years, decades, perhaps centuries, Vorthar stood alone. Truly alone. The curse was not gone. The hunger was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But he had won, not by slaughter, not by submission, but by rejecting the fate Khorne had laid before him. He turned his gaze to the wastes beyond, the endless desolation of the world before him, and he took his first step forward, not as a champion, not as a warlord, not as a pawn of the gods, but as a man who chose his own war. The Gore Spire was gone, and Vorthar Bloodrot walked away, still unbroken. Chapter 18. The Wanderer's Doom. The chaos wastes stretched before him, an endless expanse of red sand, blackened rock, and skies that bled with the echoes of war. The storm of Khorne's wrath had passed, leaving only silence. but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a warrior hunted. Vorthar's body burned with exhaustion, his wounds barely sealed, his armor cracked and caked in dried blood. His muscles ached from battle, his lungs still carried the fire of the Gore Spire's collapse, and yet he pressed on. The curse still lurked within him. The hunger was still there, whispering in the back of his mind, urging him to kill, to bathe in the blood of those who would come for him. But this was different. For the first time in his life, he did not fight for Khorne's favor. He did not fight for war's sake. He fought because it was the only way to survive. And they were coming. Hunted. The warbands had found his trail within days. The followers of Khorne did not forget betrayal. To reject the blood god's will was to spit in the face of war itself, and such defiance could not go unanswered. The first to come for him were the Hounds, a band of feral berserkers, their eyes hollow, their flesh scarred with the brands of eternal battle. They did not speak, they did not think. They only rushed him, their axes thirsting for his blood. Vorthar cut them down like beasts. But he took no joy in it. The next warband was larger. The Brass Reapers, once loyal followers of the bloodthirster Valzereth, now seeking vengeance for their fallen lord. Their champion, Gore the Skullborn, rode a warbeast clad in barbed iron, a gore-streaked glaive in his hands, his warriors dripping in the remains of their last kill. "Traitor," Gorvak spat as he charged down upon him. "You will not die with honor." Vorthar met him in kind. Their battle was brutal, relentless, a clash of strength and will, steel against steel, rage against defiance. The ground beneath them split with their fury, the wind carrying the echoes of Khorne's judgment. Vorthar emerged victorious. But his wounds deepened, his strength waned. And still, the warbands came. The breaking point. Days passed, then weeks. There was no sanctuary in the wastes. No place to rest, no refuge, no end to the hunt. His body was breaking, his flesh a ruin of old scars and fresh wounds, his armor barely holding together, the weight of his own axe heavier than ever. Yet he stood, he fought. Not because the gods willed it, not because the blood called to him, but because he would not be dragged back. He would not kneel again. He would carve his own fate, or he would die on his own terms. Then, on the twilight of the dying sun, they came. The largest warband yet, a host of Khornate warriors led by a warlord of renown, Threx the Butcher, a giant clad in spiked brass, his body a living monument of slaughter, his presence reeking of the blood god's favor. He brought 50 warriors with him, 50 hunters, 50 zealots, eager to drag Vorthar back into the fold, or take his skull in Khorne's name. "You cannot escape the blood god Bloodrot," Threx bellowed, stepping forward, his warband forming a crimson tide behind him. "You are one of us. You always will be." Vorthar did not reply. He was tired. Tired of their voices, their faith, their endless hunger for war. But tired did not mean weak. With a deep breath he lifted Gorefury once more, his grip steady, unbroken. "Make him come." And the battle began. The last stand of a dead man. They came at him like a living avalanche, shields raised, axes gleaming, the war cries of Khorne's blessed filling the air. Vorthar met them head-on. His axe was a blur of motion, cleaving through bone and iron, his strikes merciless, his mind focused not on slaughter but on survival. The first wave fell. Then the second. The wastes drank deep of blood, and still he stood. But Threx was watching, and he smiled. The warlord stepped forward, his massive blade dragging through the dirt, his eyes locked onto Vorthar like a predator savoring the final moment before a kill. "You're strong," Threx admitted, but I see it in you." He circled, his warriors closing in behind him, waiting for the final strike. "You are fading, blood-rot. You cannot run forever. You cannot fight forever." Vorthar spat blood, his chest heaving, his strength waning. He knew the warlord was right, but he also knew something else. "Maybe not," Vorthar rasped. "But I can kill you before I fall." Threx grinned. "Then let us see." And the final duel began. Steel clashed against steel, the force of their strikes sending shockwaves through the battlefield, the warriors around them forced to step back, giving way to a duel of titans. Blow after blow, blood spilled, but neither fell. Vorthar's body screamed for rest. His arms burned. His lungs ached. But he did not stop, because he would not die a slave to the blood god. He would die a man who had chosen his own path, his own doom. Threx lunged, a strike meant to cleave him in two. But Vorthar was faster. With a final roar, he stepped inside the blow, driving Gore fury through Threx's chest, the blade bursting through his back in a shower of crimson. The warlord's eyes widened. He gurgled. And then he was gone. Vorthar ripped his axe free, stepping back as Threx crumpled to his knees, blood pouring from his lips, his final breath escaping as nothing more than a sigh. The warband froze. For the first time, they hesitated. Vorthar stared them down, his body shaking, barely standing, his grip on Gore fury unsteady. He had nothing left to give. And yet the warband did not strike. Instead, they stepped back. One by one, they turned away, their vengeance fading, their faith shaken. They had come to kill a traitor. Instead, they had found a man who refused to die. And in the eyes of warriors, that was its own kind of victory. As the last of them vanished into the horizon, Vorthar let out a slow, shuddering breath. He was still alive, still free, and for the first time he did not know where his path would lead. But that, perhaps, was the only fate he had ever wanted. Chapter 19. The End of the Curse. The chaos waste stretched behind him, a land of broken gods and endless war, where the very ground was soaked in centuries of blood. Ahead there was nothing, and yet everything. Vorthar stood at the edge of existence, where the world itself grew thin, where the sky became a fractured mirror, and the land gave way to something beyond understanding. This was the fray, a place where reality dissolved, where the winds of chaos roared like wild beasts, where time bled into itself, where warriors stepped forward and never returned, where some claimed an end and others became something else entirely. It was a threshold, not a barrier, but a choice. And for the first time, Vorthar was free to make it. The weight of the curse. His body ached, his armor was broken, his blade dulled from 1,000 battles, his flesh torn and scarred beyond recognition. But the true war had never been against the warbands, the demons, or the gods themselves. It had been against himself. The curse was still there. The hunger, the endless pull toward battle, toward bloodshed, toward the ecstasy of war. He had known it would never leave him, because it was not a spell, not a trick, not a burden placed upon him by Tzeentch's scheming sorcerers, nor a punishment from the blood god himself. It was who he was. Every time he had lifted his axe, every time he had felt the thrill of a fresh kill, every time he had embraced the violence, even for a moment, he had fed it. This was not something to be cured. It was something to be controlled, or it would control him. Vorthar closed his eyes, listening to the winds howling across the fray, feeling the raw, untamed power of the unknown beyond. He had walked the wastes as a warlord. He had stood at the Gore Spire as a would-be god. He had denied Khorne's ascension, had spat in the face of eternity, had cut down those who came to drag him back into his fate. And now he stood alone, at the edge of all things. What came next was his to decide. The final choice. The Fray whispered to him, not in voices, but in possibilities. He could step forward into the unknown, let the maelstrom of chaos consume him, let fate unravel him and weave him anew, as it had done to so many warriors before him. He could stay in the wastes, forever hunted, forever pursued, forever the exiled champion, the man who walked away from the gods themselves. He could walk his own path, neither bound to Khorne nor to cowardice, neither consumed by bloodlust nor afraid to wield it. His curse was not a chain. It was a weapon, one that could break him, or one that could become something greater. For years he had fought for Khorne, for war, for slaughter. But what if he fought for something else? Not for the gods, not for the world, but for himself. Vorthar opened his eyes. The fray raged before him. The wastes waited behind him. And in that moment, he chose. Chapter 20. The Eternal Struggle. The sky burned with the glow of distant fire, its embers flickering against the darkness of the chaos wastes. A battle raged on the horizon, its war cries carried by the winds, a clash of steel, flesh, and fury. The scent of blood and smoke filled the air, thick enough to choke, thick enough to stir the hunger inside him once more. And yet, Vorthar did not rush toward it as he once would have. He did not bellow in Khorne's name, did not seek the slaughter for the sake of slaughter itself. He simply walked forward, not as a champion of the blood god, not as a pawn of fate, but as a man who chose his own war. The call of battle. The warriors in the distance fought with savage abandon, their weapons clashing like thunder, their screams woven into a song of carnage. Even from afar, he could tell who they were. One warband wore the blackened plate of the skull-forged, their weapons etched with the marks of the blood god, their eyes hollow with zealotry. Khorne's faithful. Their enemies were lesser men, a ragtag force of desperate survivors, mortals who had likely wandered too deep into the wastes only to find themselves caught in the maw of slaughter. They would not last. Khorne's warriors would see them broken, their skulls offered to the brass throne, their blood feeding the endless war. It was how it had always been. The cycle of violence and conquest, the eternal machine of war grinding onward, uncaring, unrelenting. And yet, something in Vorthar shifted. Not a champion, not a slave. He had been here before. He had led these men before. He had cut them down before. Every warband he had ever joined, every army that had ever followed his banner, had ended in the same fate, because he could never stop, because the hunger always consumed. But now he was no longer bound. He had denied the blood god's call, had spat in the face of eternity, had walked away from ascension, from servitude, from fate itself. Yet he was still a warrior. He would always be a warrior, not because Khorne demanded it, not because the bloodlust dictated it, but because it was his choice. He did not fight for a god. He did not fight for glory. He fought because he was good at it. He fought because he wanted to. And so, as the battle ahead reached its fever pitch, as the skull gorge roared in exultation, as the desperate men bled and screamed for their dying gods, Vorthar Bloodrot walked toward it. The cycle began anew. But this time it was his cycle, his work, and his alone. The end.